Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, all the parties in this election have laid out their priorities for Brexit, but they've also faced accusation that their plans lack detail. Well, in the last hour, you may have seen I asked representatives from 4 of the parties just how realistic their ambitions are when it comes to the rights of EU nationals living in the UK.
In the real world of diplomacy, and I spent 6 years in the Foreign Office, actually what Labour's proposing would do the reverse. No. We would be hanging out to dry British citizens. No. So what we said is we want to treat both sets, EU nationals here and British expats, the same, get it resolved early. And do you know what? For all the gesture politics, the EU, in their negotiating mandate, say we want to deal with both early as well.
Of course, all this we're far more concerned about the EU citizens in our country than our own citizens abroad. Because everyone's talking about guaranteeing their rights, and I don't often agree with Mrs May, but I think it has to be a reciprocal arrangement. And what we've said is, well, of course, we want people who are already here and established to go on with the rights that they've already got. But one thing, if I may make an important point, the EU, we can sign a deal with the EU for this, but they can't enforce it. We're going to have 27 bilateral agreements with different countries, because the EU may sign a deal, but it has no way of enforcing that in those particular countries. I get people write to me all the time about EU law, which isn't enforced in EU countries.
Of British citizens in the EU made clear that they supported a unilateral guarantee by Britain, and that would be a catalyst to reciprocal pledges from GE27. It would be a gesture of utter goodwill, and not to guarantee the rights of EU citizens here is one of the many examples of stories shooting ourselves in the foot. But what it means is not only it's morally wrong because it's creating anxiety, but it's creating economic damage.
Well, joining me now is Sky's election analyst, Michael Thrasher, and we're talking about what people's feelings about Brexit are doing with their feelings about which party to vote for. Let's just remind ourselves of the famous figures. That was it. 52% voted to leave, 48% voted to remain. And bearing in mind, I suppose, that UKIP and the Conservative Party are the Leave Party, and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats are the Remain parties a lot. Does that mean that the vote is splitting 52-48?
It doesn't.
OK, you surprised me.
And we've been looking at the Sky data in detail about how people will vote on the basis of how they voted in the EU referendum. And as you might expect, amongst Leave voters, Mrs May enjoys now a significant advantage over the other parties. There you can see that 72% of Leavers favour the Conservative Party, just 17% for Labour, 5% for UKIP, because obviously UKIP's vote has been tumbling since the EU referendum. And significantly, what doesn't really appear on that graph is the Lib Dems. And in terms of leadership ratings, again, Mrs May is quite significant.
This is amongst Leave voters. She's the only one.
This is amongst Leave, yes. And so she's the only one with positive ratings there. Mr Corbyn is quite unpopular amongst Leave voters, and especially also is Tim Farron. So that's the Leave camp, and it follows probably a predictable pattern. So when we look at the Remain voters,
the other side, the 48%,
the other side of that, we see that again, Mrs May is still ahead of this group simply because, Labour is now ahead in this group, but Mrs May is still doing well in this group, but Labour is ahead. But look at the Lib Dems there. They're just on 14%. And really this was the key part of the Liberal Democrat strategy for the 2017 election, to appeal to all of those people that voted Remain. And again, if we look at the leadership ratings amongst the Remain voters, we can see that we're just waiting for that. We can see that Tim Farron is on -10. So even amongst,
and I mean, they're all negative ratings there. Yes. But actually, the least negative amongst Remain voters is still Mrs May.
Tim Farron is minus 10, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of almost the best of a bad bunch. It's quite clear that the Remain voters are not terribly happy about the whole situation. They're not happy about having lost the vote. And they're not terribly happy with any of the leaders. But I think crucially for the Liberal Democrats and the leader Tim Farron, this is a problem in as much as I think what they were trying to do is copy what happened in Scotland and the way in which the SNP mobilised the independence vote, and it all shipped to them in the 2015 general election. It isn't happening in the 2017 general election for the Liberal Democrats.
But it has to be said that if Mrs May has got the lion's share of the Leave voters and a third of the Remain voters, prospects are pretty good for her.
Yes, and the more we look at the polls now, the more it's less about how people voted in the EU referendum now, in terms of predicting how people are going to vote, and age has suddenly become far more important. The Conservative, although we've been talking about the lead narrowing, the Conservative vote is reasonably stable, and the real explanation for that is amongst people aged over 65, support for the Conservatives has not budged. And Labour's support is growing.
Even although they were hit by the social care proposal?
Hardly at all. A couple of percentage points at the most, it seems. But amongst the 18 to 24-year-old voters, those people that are new in this election, perhaps, support for Labour is quite considerable there. The problem for Labour is that these people in the past have not voted. Even though they've said they are going to vote, when it comes actually to posting a ballot or going along to the polling station on June the 8th, they haven't performed in the past.
Michael, thank you very much indeed.
Now, the Conservatives have now promised that they will meet their target of cutting net migration to less than 100,000 people per year by the end of the next Parliament if they win the election. The Prime Minister said they will hit the immigration target by 2022, and they've denied there is any confusion after ministers appear to have slightly different takes on the timetable. Speaking to me yesterday, Conservative Minister Brandon Lewis pledged they would hit that target in 5 years. Here's what he said. You're saying tens of thousands in 5 years' time?
Over the course of the Parliament, yes.
Right, so by 2022, that's the guarantee.
EU and non-EU, down to tens of thousands.
We want to see migration levels coming down to sustainable levels, which we think is tens of thousands over the course of the next Parliament. Yes.
So the electorate will be able to hold you to account on that particular issue?
That's what's in our manifesto.
Brandon Lewis speaking yesterday. However, the Brexit Secretary David Davis appeared on Question Time last night and gave a slightly more cautious answer, saying the Tories would aim to hit the target in 5 years, but couldn't promise to do so. Here's what he had to say.
But slowly, but it's got to be
David,
managed
sorry,
carefully.
I just want to clarify this. Are you saying that it is Tory party policy, if you're re-elected as the government next Thursday, to get it down to 100,000 within the 5 years of a parliament?
No,
is that your aim?
To get it down. The aim, yes, but we can't promise within 5 years. That's the point.
Well, that was David Davis speaking last night. So what are the positions of each of the main parties when it comes to immigration? Well, the Conservative manifesto pledges to reduce immigration to sustainable levels in the tens of thousands and to place tighter restrictions on student visas. Labour reject setting a target figure but promise reasonable management of migration, and they would remove students from migration figures. UKIP pledged to reduce net migration to 0 over a 5-year period, while the Lib Dems say immigration is essential to our economy and a benefit to our society. Meanwhile, the SNP want immigration powers devolved to Scotland so they can have different rules to the rest of the UK. Toby Young, what do you understand by the Conservative commitment here to bring down net migration to tens of thousands? Is it a pledge that will be hit by 2022, or is it just an aspiration?
I think it's an ambition rather than a promise, and whether or not it's achieved partly hinges on what sort of Brexit deal we manage to get. I don't think it's very sensible for Labour to try and turn this into a row, because Labour doesn't have any ambition to reduce immigration at all.
They would argue because they say it's unachievable, and of course it has so far proven unachievable. It was set in 2010, first of all, and of course the coalition government and the subsequent Tory governments have absolutely catastrophically failed to meet it.
It's achievable, Joe, if we get a good Brexit deal, and that seems
by
much
2022.
less by 2022, and that seems much less likely if Jeremy Corbyn is there negotiating the deal than Theresa May. And it's worth pointing out that Diane Abbott, who is due to be the Home Secretary if Labour win next week, has said that she thinks that freedom of movement is an inalienable workers' right. So it seems inconceivable that immigration will fall by even one if Labour are elected next week.
But what's the point of setting a target that actually even ministers themselves can't agree whether it is achievable by 2022 or not?
Well, I don't think they want to be tied to it because it obviously hinges on what sort of deal the Prime Minister and her team managed to negotiate in the Brexit negotiations.
But it's not just tied to that Brexit deal, is it? Because they've made that commitment before we had an EU referendum, and they still failed to meet it.
But they will be able to meet it if they get a good Brexit deal. And I think with Theresa May negotiating it, we have every chance of doing that.
Right. I mean, isn't the point that Labour doesn't have any even aspiration or aim to do anything about immigration? And is that because, rightly or wrongly, they want to keep freedom of movement and immigration high?
You say they don't have the aspiration to, quote-unquote, do anything about immigration. That is not true. What they want to do is to place it on a fair basis that is commensurate with the strategy they have for negotiating a Brexit deal that allows access to the single market. Now, when we were covering the Brexit referendum, I was covering it for Channel 4, again and again, people who wanted to come out of Europe would say to you, I'm not bothered about the numbers, it's the principles that I'm bothered about, that everybody can come, that everybody can immediately have access to the NHS and education system. I think the power of saying, first of all, the power of saying, let's elaborate the principle, the fair system, the numbers come second. And it's also true that, you know, the Tories recognise, I agree with David Davis on this, that a £6 billion hit to the economy from achieving that target is something you want to weigh up. You know, you want to be careful about the way you achieve it, and businesses know you can't achieve it in the radical and sort of rhetorical way that the Tory right, the kind of, you know, anti-immigration xenophobes actually want to.
Right, but the problem is, Paul Mason, you say you understood that when you spoke to people about what they wanted in terms of taking back control, and they weren't so bothered about the numbers. Do you think there are still many people in Britain who would like to see the numbers come down? That's what they understood by taking back control?
Yes, I think there are.
But can Labour actually commit to doing that?
No, because there are also people, entirely fair-minded people who may have voted Conservative or UKIP in the last election, who understand that as long as you deal with the principle, that is more sensible than setting an arbitrary target when it's possible that we get 500,000 Brits coming back from Spain that completely blows that target out of the water.
Well, it's helpful having Paul here because he's now clarified what Labour's policy is on this, even though we do
I don't
different
speak
things
for
from
Labour,
different
I'm
people.
just a Labour supporting journalist.
It sounds like Labour's policy, when it goes into the Brexit negotiations, will be to stay in the single market, even if that means...
No, that's
they
not
have
true.
said in their manifesto that they want to end freedom of movement. The problem is, though...
But you can't stay in the single market and do that, and clearly the single market is a priority for Labour.
And will people believe them? Because actually not that long before, Jeremy Corbyn said that Labour isn't wedded to freedom of movement for EU citizens as a point of principle, but I don't want that to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out, because personally he is in favour of freedom of movement.
So let's understand what freedom of movement is in the EU context. It's a qualified right. It's not an inalienable right of workers, whether Diane Abbott said it or not. Legally, it is a qualified right.
But it's one of the four pillars. You cannot be in the single market without freedom of movement
So
of
when we
labour
come out of
capital.
Europe, it will end. There will be a fair migration system. I hope that fair migration system does involve fewer low-paid agency workers coming in. I think the Cabinet Office, they didn't put it in the manifesto, are discussing trying to create a floor for salaries on which you can exercise your freedom.
Except that
I would favour that.
Right, except both Labour and the Conservatives have said that they do still need low-skilled workers to come into Britain. Even Andrea Leadsom is reported to be seeking assurances for farmers and the agricultural community to get those seasonal workers in.
Otherwise they're going to tank the economy.
So, in the end, it is still going to be very difficult to keep that commitment to reducing or completely cutting unskilled workers coming in from the EU.
I'm not sure we'll need more than tens of thousands of net migrants in order to pick apples once we've left the EU.
That's just one sector.
Paul, just to be clear, if keeping freedom of movement is a condition of remaining in the single market, you choose remaining in the single market.
No, you're not listening to me. It is a condition, and that is why Labour is seeking access to the single market and not membership of it, because we will end freedom of movement.
Well, everyone can have access, but tariff-free access, I think, is what both parties say.
my pen.